Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. My sophomore year of high school, I got really into public speaking. I loved it. I loved the idea that whenever I got up in front of an audience, whether it be formal or informal, that I was almost telling a story. And I had the ability to captivate the audience's attention. And I had the ability to have them hang on to my every word. Well, last winter, for almost the first time, I was actually sought out for my speaking ability. And I got the chance to go to New York City and get to speak to some kids in the Bronx and try to convince them to come to a mission trip organization that I got to work for. Because they sought me out, I wanted to do a really good job. I was terrified that if I went in and I was lackluster in any aspect, that I was really going to fail. And that was something that I was fearful of. I didn't want to fail. I was going to New York City. I was speaking to a group that was in the middle of the Bronx. And I stuck out like a sore thumb. See, all of my anxieties kept building and building. The fact that I stuck out, the fact that I wasn't in a home territory or a home base, the fact that I knew nobody. But then it hit me. Be strong and courageous. To fully understand where this verbiage of being strong and courageous comes from, we have to take a look back in Joshua, and more specifically Joshua 1 verses 1 through 9, really culminating in that last verse, verse 9, where it says to be strong and courageous and do it in the name of the Lord, because the Lord is with us always. It's such a wonderful reminder. But how did we get here? How did we get here with Joshua in the first place, where he needed to be told to be strong and courageous? Now, Joshua is one of my favorite Bible characters, but he's mentioned way before the book of Joshua. He's actually mentioned for the first time back in Exodus 17:9, when Moses personally seeks him out to get together their first militia since leaving Egypt. We see him again when Moses sends spies into Canaan. And from what we know, he and Caleb were the only two spies that came back and said that if the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us. The positive report that Moses was looking for, knowing that if God was with them, there was nothing that they could not accomplish. Then in Deuteronomy 31, we see Joshua again, when he's finally chosen to lead the Israelites after Moses' death. It says, "And the Lord commissioned Joshua, the son of Nun, and said, Be strong and courageous, for you shall bring the people of Israel into the land that I swore to give them. I will be with you." Here we really get a chance to see a glimpse into Joshua's character. He's someone who was steadfast in the Lord, loved the Lord his God, and was willing to do whatever it took. And for the first time we see that verbiage, be strong and courageous. Finally, right at the end of Deuteronomy, we see the death of Moses. And while this is tough for the Israelites to bear, we know that this now means it's time for Joshua. Now, after Moses' death, Joshua is chosen to lead God's chosen people. And while it never directly says it, can you imagine? Joshua had to be at least a little fearful, maybe a little nervous, maybe a little anxious. I mean, it's just human nature. He was chosen to lead God's chosen people. Now, he didn't know the extent of everything that he was going to do. As we read throughout Joshua, we hear about all the great things that he does with the Lord by his side. But I could never imagine having to stand there at the very beginning of this road, having no idea that all of those things were going to happen, and not being at least a little anxious. I know it's in my human nature, and I'm sure it's in yours as well. I know from an earthly standpoint, I certainly get nervous with even a sliver of responsibility. I get nervous whenever somebody asks me to do something that I've never done before. I get nervous whenever I'm thrown into situations that I'm not the most comfortable with. It's just human nature to a certain point. I think we see this from a human standpoint. Fear is natural, and it can be brought up by whatever reason, whether you just want to do a good job, whether you're afraid of getting hurt, or you need a certain situation to come out of something, whatever it might be, there's 1,000 things in this world that could complicate fears and anxieties, and they could bring them all up at different points. But we never get a passing phrase. We don't get a sentence. We don't even get a word to indicate that Joshua was fearful. But even if he was, right at the start of Joshua, God gives probably one of the greatest pep talks you're ever going to hear. Joshua starts out where God reminds Joshua of all the things that he's going to do as leader. He reminds him that Israel still has to cross the Jordan. He reminds him that they still have to go into the land of Canaan that God had promised them. But then it gets a little bit more specific into what God needs out of Joshua. And that's where we pick up in Joshua 1, verse 5. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. And here, if you've tuned out at any point, please listen in right here. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. God says, if you follow my law, no man will stand against you. Just as I was with Moses, I will be with you. If you are strong and courageous, there is nothing you can't accomplish in my name. David Guzik writes that verses 6 through 9 can simply be titled The Conditions to the Promise of Victory. But he doesn't want us to get it confused. It's not through Joshua himself. You see, our confidence really shouldn't be in Joshua at all, but instead it's in God. You see, we can be filled with self-confidence, but it will ultimately lead us to ruin. Instead, we need to be filled with a God confidence. It's so much greater than the self-confidence that we could maybe think we see in Joshua, as opposed to the confidence that Joshua sees in God. Crawford Loritts has a very interesting idea of what God's actually trying to tell us in this final part of the passage, and it has everything to do with the way that God uses us. Loritts says, the ability to endure depends on your ability to resolve. If you act courageously, you'll get more courage. God is with you, but he'll only strengthen you when you raise your leg and you put it forward. He can't steer a parked car. The wind will only blow when you put up the sail. So here we see three things. We see the character of man, we see the character of God, and then we see how we're supposed to put those things together. First, with the character of man, we see that we're naturally fearful. We see that we get into different situations, and it's just kind of the way that we are to get scared about those things. But then we see the character of God, the one that is all-knowing and will never put you into a situation that you cannot face with him. Everything that we do, we can face with God. So whenever we put those together, though we might be fearful, though those things might happen, the God that was with Moses, the God that was with Joshua, the God that was with Jesus is still with you today, telling you, do not be frightened, do not be dismayed, be strong and courageous, and know that the Lord your God is with you always. So maybe when our fears and anxieties feel like they're controlling us, maybe we should take a few notes from Joshua. Fear can be found in everything. Everything we do, multiplied to the nth degree, can somehow bring up a fear in our lives. But If we let that fear control us, it becomes a plague and it can control everything we do. So the application here is really simple. Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened. Do not be dismayed. For the Lord our God is with us always. If I had stopped and I let my fear control me, I might have never had gotten to do the things I got to do. I might have never made it to New York. I might have never walked into the front doors of those buildings, and I might not have ever stepped up in front of those people. But if those things had happened, I would have never gotten up and been able to speak. I would have never been able to get up and make the lifelong connections that I made on that day. And I would have never gotten to bring more people closer to Christ. I'll leave you with this. To be strong and courageous is all the difference. Put that leg in front of the other. Be the started car. Put the sails up. Be ready for whatever God is going to do. And if you're ever fearful, if you're ever anxious, understand it's natural. But God doesn't want you to get it twisted. The same God that was with Moses, the same God that was with Joshua, the same God that was with Jesus is telling you one very important thing. Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened. Do not be dismayed. For the Lord your God is with you always. Be strong and courageous.